Well, welcome back, everyone. We hope you had a good morning. This is our third session of a jam-packed agenda focusing on big picture issues where philanthropy, civil society, and generosity intersect. The session that you'll be joining now is titled Beyond Grants: How International Donors Can Contribute to the Ecosystem of Latin American Generosity. It's a very timely issue this year, given the change in international aid and cooperation. And we are very grateful to the three speakers who represent the Latin American Funders Collective, a new initiative by Focus Central America, Tawingo Fund, and the Tinker Foundation. Our speakers are bilingual, are trilingual, but have agreed to have the plenary here today in English and also in Spanish, as you hear from Doménica. You have interpretation, as you already know. You can click on the globe icon to translate to here in English, in Spanish, or Portuguese. You can share your questions on either the chat or the Q&A. It's easier for us to follow if you share them on the Q&A. And before sharing the floor to our wonderful speakers, I want to thank them all, to thank Caroline, Mollie, and Domenica for being here with us, for being so open to share and have this 80 minutes exchange with all of us throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. As part of my work as a Giving Tuesday leader for Latin America and the Caribbean, only recently I've become aware of the work of Focus Central America, Tawingo Fund, despite the fact that Tinker Foundation have been following from Brazil for many years now. And I was very happy to get closer to them and understand what they've been doing and the way they think on the support they give to grassroots organizations in Central America, in Latin America, and the Caribbean. And I'm in love with their work and their commitment to grow the capacity of local organizations and support local leaders through support to local leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean. So thank you for being here. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, JP, for having us, and thanks everyone for joining this conversation. A couple of things JP mentioned, we're going to have interpretation. We're also going to have some polls going during this conversation. And so I want to make sure that everyone knows how to use the polls in the Zoom. I'm going to apologize ahead of time because I'm having some technical difficulties. So if I'm seem scattered at all, that's why. But my name is Mollie, Executive Director of the Tawingo Fund. And I am here with my peers. Okay, there we go, Caroline. I wanted to make sure I could see the deck. I was worried about that one. Okay, great. So I'm Mollie Van Horn. I'm going to introduce myself after we hear a little bit just quickly from the other featured speakers on this conversation, who are Domenica and Caroline from Focus Central America and Tinker. Domenica, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Mollie, and thank you, JP, for the introductions. I love the idea of the videos. I love it. Well, my name is Doménica Chévez. I'm based in one of the smallest countries in Latin America, El Salvador. I'm the Director of Partnerships at Focus Central America Foundation. Focus is one of the three foundations of Seagull Philanthropies. We provide funds for civil society organizations in the 7 countries of Central America. We also building alliances, networks, and helping organizations to build capacity. I'm very excited to be here today to share some of the work we do, and of course to explore a little more on how we can strengthen generosity and collaboration in the region. Thank you, Mollie.
And I can introduce myself next. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm Caroline Kronley from the Tinker Foundation. Tinker is a private foundation based in New York that exclusively funds in Latin America and almost always to organizations that are based in and led from the region in a number of different program areas. And in recent years, we've been focused much more on how we can partner with others, including my colleagues here today, also funders in the region, to respond to all of the amazing work and opportunities that we see as funders, and our awareness that there's so much more good work that could be done with more resources both within and from outside the region. So thank you so much for this space.
Great. So thank you, Caroline and Doménica, for introducing yourself. As I said, I'm Mollie Van Horn, Executive Director of the Tawingo Fund. We are a small fund based out of Boston, Mass, focusing on organizations with budgets around $10,000 to $500,000 and really hard to reach NGOs that don't have access to traditional funders, but are really taking on life-saving work. We aspire to connect people with each other, which I think is extra important when we're working within Latin America, which just has fewer international funders, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So next slide, please. So we wanted to just acknowledge, we know that this conference is really focused on giving within Latin America. So we are here to offer a perspective about how international giving can complement this. We're really humbled and grateful for the opportunity to be here with you guys. And we're hoping to share a bit more about how to work with US funders. What are some of the challenges that make arise? What are some of the things that we hear as funders within the US around perceived challenges to giving to Latin America? And then really want to end the conversation talking about some concrete tools for engaging with international donors for you guys that are hopefully helpful. So help us get a sense for who is here. If everyone could please answer the poll that should be appearing around, does your work on generosity in Latin America include engaging US donors? And it's going to be a yes or a no. So JP, I'm not supposed to be ending it, correct? Someone else will do that?
Yes, we have MAPI supporting it.
Okay. Great.
Right now, poll is running, so people is answering.
Okay. I can see the answers coming in. About 74% so far have answered yes, that you are involved in working with US donors, and 26% have answered no. So most people have participated. If you haven't taken the poll, give it one more minute. And if we don't hear back, we can continue on.
Yes, we can continue.
Okay, great. Okay. Oh, 100% answered. Great. Okay. So, all right. So the majority of you, but not by that much, have experience working with US donors, which is great because we hope that this will help to sort of debunk some of the myths and not myths or just challenges that you've had working with US donors. And we hope that we can give you some insight. And then for those of you that have not had experience working with US donors, hopefully this gives you a really good starting point. So a bit about our story. Why are these three funders on this call? Who are we? What are we all about? For years as funders to Latin America from the US, we all really struggled to find peer funders that we could work with. Just a challenge to find Latin American funders across the US. And then one morning, I had a very interesting and sort of eye-opening experience where I had 2 meetings back to back, and one of them was with a bunch of funders 4 funders to Africa. They were all funders that were looking at a pilot in an unproven opportunity, and I was basically trying to raise money to gather our funds to start this pilot. And within 10 minutes of the call, I had secured $20,000 from each of these funders. So we had $80,000. It was probably the fastest time I ever collected $80,000 for an organization. And we went and did, and the pilot was up and running. I then went to a meeting with Caroline and Jody, Jody Ringel, who's the executive director of Tinker Foundation. I'm sorry, of Focus Central America. And Caroline, who's on the call, who's the president of the Tinker Foundation. And we were talking about how we could try to find more funders for for 3 organizations that had just lost funding due to one of their funders pulling out of the entire region. Each organization had lost about 50% of their funding, which was about $50,000 per organization. And we were putting our heads together to see how we could try to find other funders to really save these organizations from having to shut their doors. And we sat there on the call and we just had silence. We could not think of other potential funders to fund these organizations. And it was really an eye-opening, jarring experience. So one of the things that we sort of concluded from that was there was definitely a need to find more Latin American funders. And the data really shows us that. Great. So this data is a bit old, but it's the best data we have. It is from covers 2015 to 2019 and was basically gathered in 2022. So this is the last real data that we have on global philanthropy and giving from the US for private foundations to international places, basically. The big thing that stands out for me on this is the 8.4 billion going to sub-Saharan Africa and the 2.1 billion going to Latin America. So that 1/4 of sub-Saharan Africa is what I saw in the meeting and what we experienced in the meeting. If you could move to the next slide, Caroline. But if we dig into this data a bit more, we see it's even more of a challenging situation. 700 million is about the annual average from US private philanthropy to Latin America. But we have to dig in deeper on that. About 5 US foundations contribute 50% of this 700 million. So they are focusing on about 50% of that, so $350 million, mostly to 501c3s. And a 501c3 is a legal categorization for in the US that enables an organization to receive a tax deduction, basically. So 501c3s are not typically headquartered in Latin America or beyond the US. Therefore, only about 350 million is going to locally led organizations like many of you lead or are involved in. So a big challenge for locally led organizations. And then the other figure we want to look at is the about 2 billion that you see on there that was from the USAID budget in 2023. And we all know that USAID has now gone away. So that is leaving a $2 billion gap. And it's worth noting that Central America was a pilot area for a lot of USAID localization. So many locally led organizations were just starting to receive USAID funding. And then, the administration pulled all of that funding over the last 6 months. So there's a major gap that we know exists and that we see. And then, unfortunately, the 700 million of private philanthropy cannot make up that $2 billion gap. And so it's really just an ongoing challenge for finding more funding to send to the Latin American region. Next slide, please. So back to the story of Caroline and Jody and I on the conversation about trying to get more funders. We started to ask ourselves, what if more generosity in the US moved across borders? And then what if more of that funding went to Latin America? And what if locally led organizations benefited the most? We also knew that we wanted to work towards enabling organizations in the region to have access to more funders of locally led organizations that traditionally struggle to reach US donors. And we wanted to try to build confidence in US donors that they can safely give to Latin America. So what we decided to do from all of these conversations and all of these questions that we were asking ourselves was to bring in a consultant to do a project to help us to try to find new Latin American funders. And out of that project, we decided to create what is called the Latin American Funders Collective, which has a goal of really supporting US-based donors interested in learning more about giving in Latin America. We share our learnings, offer perspectives where needed, and tap our network to make relevant introductions along the way. And we are deeply committed to empowering and connecting leaders and communities in the region. So the collective strives to break down silos in the philanthropic sector and act as a go-to resource on giving in Latin America, which is honestly a lot of fancy jargon for what is simply a group of funders who want to share with other donors and philanthropic advisors at no cost, so we don't charge anything, our experience funding in the region to try to mobilize more locally led funding to the region. We know there's a lot of amazing efforts going on in the region already to bring donors together and educate on funding. Many of you are probably on this call, and we are definitely not trying to duplicate efforts that already exist. We're just trying to fill any gaps that we can. We also want to note we are not fundraising for any of this work, and we are also not being hired by organizations who are seeking funding, which is something that we've been asked. So last slide from me is about, so what are we doing? We've been around for a year or so, and our current activities have involved bringing together new and existing donors for Latin America to share information. So we've done a variety of different ways of doing that. We are working directly with donors to provide information and referrals and introductions when they request it. And then we are doing things like this session, which are trying to demystify international giving and break down the barriers to international giving. So those are the things we're doing so far. It's totally a pro bono effort. We have other jobs that we do as well, of course, running the organizations, but we love this work, and we're really trying to do our best to try to drive as many people as we can to give in the region. And with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Caroline.
Great. Thank you so much, Mollie, for kind of sharing that story of who we are and how we came together. I will, in this part of the presentation, share a little bit more about what we've learned from reaching out to a lot of donors from the US, both institutional philanthropy foundations, but also individual donors who have an interest or commitment to the region. Share some of what we're learning and hearing from them, and try to think about how it might be relevant to this audience of organizations in Latin America looking to promote generosity and support really critical work. One thing I did want to mention to my colleagues is that since I'm operating the slides, I can't see the chat, so please jump in if there's anything really critical that I should be aware of in the chat. So we learned earlier that about 3/4 of you are already engaging in one way or another with US donors. And so, probably some of what I will be sharing in terms of what we've been hearing from our peer donors in the United States will be familiar. I hope this will also be in some ways kind of validating or reinforcing of challenges that you've had. We've had those challenges and frustrations too, as we seek to motivate more giving to the region. So we'll share some of those insights, and then while it's hard to have too much of an open exchange with so many attendees in such a large session, we'll have some further polls, as Mollie mentioned, to make sure that we're bringing your voices into this conversation as much as possible. So this next section I've organized really simply just in terms of some of the challenges that we've encountered or observed in trying to motivate our fellow donors in the United States to do more in the region, and especially to give to locally led organizations. And then, because we're optimists, we'll end by talking about even more opportunities that we see. So the first real challenge, and I think the data that Mollie presented very much reinforces this quantitatively, is that there is in fact a limited universe of US donors that are actively giving in the region. And we've knocked on a lot of doors in the last year, and sort of haven't dramatically increased our census, right, of who those donors are. We see a kind of fixed number of foundations that are regularly and predictably giving in the region. And we're also really actively exploring, as Mollie mentioned, the world of individual donors in the United States who have a lot of philanthropic resources and may have a connection to the region, but don't yet know how to take the first steps toward giving to organizations in the region. But I would say to all of you, if you're having challenges identifying, US-based funders that work in the spaces or domains that you work in, that's not necessarily a surprising outcome. It is a more, limited group than for some other regions. Mollie already referenced the enormous impact that USAID and other US government bilateral assistance cuts have had. And I would highlight that these impacts, and we see this very much in our own grantee partners at the Tinker Foundation, it's not just the direct impacts of organizations that received funding directly from these agencies, but also the kind of domino effect of funding being cut to smaller agencies, perhaps, that were also active in the region, or to large international NGOs that in turn funded local organizations. So this has been a very real, significant, sudden and shocking shift to the ecosystem. And I think we're still seeing the repercussions of this playing out. One thing that I want to highlight in talking to other donors about how they're thinking about moving forward in this new context is that most US foundations and other large, US donors working in the region, their first impulse has really been to double down or to reinforce their support for existing partners. And this may be a trend that you're seeing as you're engaging with these donors. So not because they see so much need among their partners that have been affected by these cuts, they're not necessarily looking to bring on new partners as well. I was just in the Wings session immediately before this one, which I'd really recommend. It was an excellent kind of analysis of the future of generosity in Latin America. And one of the really important points made very clearly in that session is that private philanthropy cannot and should not replace the state. And that also private philanthropy really cannot and should not replace international cooperation. So for all of us as funders, our challenge is to not think about how do we mobilize $2 billion a year like USAID was spending in the region. That's beyond our possibilities. But what we can be thinking about strategically with our partners is how we help to build resilience of organizations in this new world that I think, at least for the near term, will be our collective reality. But again, if you are finding in your conversations with donors kind of closed doors or a message of we're focusing on our current partners and not on new partners, that's not particularly surprising. That's what we're hearing too. And finally, in terms of the kind of existing donor landscape in the region, one thing that we found is that most donors seem to really be relying on on their existing networks, on referrals from other funders and organizations, rather than open call processes in order to identify new partners. So again, if you're looking for and not finding, open calls to apply to, that's because many of the donors from the US that are active in the region really aren't using that strategy to source new organizations to fund. The Tinker Foundation actually does have an open call process. And I can tell you that we are now receiving 3 to 4 times the number of applications that we received before the pandemic. So it's quite striking to see how much demand there is for support from the region. And at the same time, it's also understandable that US-based donors that don't necessarily have significant resources to bring to the region are hesitant to have open call processes when there's that level of demand. So there's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem there, that if organizations aren't already in the existing networks of donors, it may be hard to get that first opportunity to open up a conversation. And again, that's part of what we see our role being, is making sure that that US donors know about the incredible diversity and reach of great organizations doing work in the region, not just the kind of frequently named organizations that are often at the sort of top of the list, right? So we want to make sure that the broad range of organizations doing excellent work in the region is visible to donors, even donors who aren't necessarily, for example, able to have truly open processes. And now I'll share a little bit about the challenges for donors who are maybe not yet working in the region, but are interested. And this is an area that we've really focused on a lot, because we believe that there are so many connections between the United States and Latin America and the Caribbean. There are a lot of reasons to believe that there could be more philanthropic funding flowing, more collaboration between people in the United States and people in the region. But we've heard some consistent challenges from donors who are kind of compelled or interested, but not yet giving. And so I'll just briefly highlight those. One is simply feeling that these new donors feel a little overwhelmed, right? They see a huge region, countries very different from each other, even countries very different within themselves, and not really having a sense of what the right first step is, and perhaps not feeling like they have the tools or resources to be able to make their first moves as donors. And again, that's the problem that we're trying to solve by accompanying those donors, telling them, what conferences they might go to get more information, what experts they might want to reach out to, and so forth. And then we've also noted that donors tend to perceive a lot of barriers and risks in terms of giving in the region, some of which are legitimate. It is somewhat more difficult to make a donation to an organization based in another country than it is to, in US terminology, to write a check to a nonprofit organization in the United States. On the other hand, and we'll talk about this more in the opportunity section, there are a lot of tools and resources available to facilitate that for donors. And then I think there's also some kind of perceptions or even misperceptions about the region that can sometimes get in the way of donors, fulfilling their interest or enthusiasm about giving in the region. So they might, for example, not understand the range and diversity and sophistication of organizations that are based in the region. They might make assumptions about the security conditions or governance conditions in the entire region based on, the very limited news that might arrive to the United States about what's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. So again, our job is to help, Mollie used the word, kind of demystify what it's like to give in the region and make clear that we are confident doing so, and other donors with the right sort of steps and information should be as well. So I promised to share some opportunities as well, and there really are many of them that we're seeing and that we're going to continue to pursue from the Latin America Funders Collective. So I think that this is a better time than has ever existed for US donors to give internationally and give to the region. There are so many supports and tools that are available to US donors who want to do more in the region, and particularly who want to give to locally led organizations that understand the needs of the communities that they work in, that serve the communities that they work in, and that draw on the strengths of the communities that they work in. So, I mentioned a couple of them, whether it's, conferences, expert advisors. One particular resource that I'll mention that I think is really important especially for new donors who don't necessarily have the capacity for direct grant making, is intermediaries. So this intermediaries is a very broad term. It basically refers to any entity that receives funding, in this case from a donor in the United States, and transfers it to an organization based in Latin America. There are intermediaries that are based in the United States that are, deep experts on US compliance, and also ensuring that donors who give through these intermediaries realize the tax deduction that they're often looking for. So examples of these intermediaries include CAF, the Charities Aid Foundation, the Resource Foundation, Myriad USA. There are also a number of really excellent and expert intermediaries that are based in the region working on different topics and issues. One thing I'll also really highlight for the organizations here is that essentially every country in the region has an organization based in the United States that specializes in channeling charitable funds from the United States to organizations in that country. And this is a really great way for organizations in the region to tap into diaspora philanthropy, right? So the large communities, as a nation of immigrants, the United States has people from everywhere, and often those people are motivated to give back in their communities of origin or their communities of heritage. So organizations like the Brazil Foundation, Help Peru, Amigos de Costa Rica. I'll mention Ventura, that specializes in Venezuela, because I was so inspired by that video we saw at the beginning. So all of these kinds of country-specific organizations are a great partner, not only to US donors that want to focus their giving to one specific part of the region, but also to organizations in those countries that want a seamless way to engage with and attract US donors. So if you haven't already identified the US organization working with your country, that would be a concrete suggestion. Some other emerging opportunities that we're really excited about. We see a growing trend toward alliances between Latin American and US donors. So foundations in the US working with philanthropic foundations and entities in Latin America. That's particularly visible in a few areas like education, migration. And it's a really exciting opportunity, I think, because each partner brings to the table kind of complementary expertise. And we can also think more expansively about Latin American donors by thinking about, for example, community or in Colombia, territorial foundations that are mobilizing local resources. And we see US donors, having interest in sort of supporting and catalyzing that local philanthropy. So I think especially now that it's clear that we're operating in a landscape without the same level of international cooperation that had previously existed. Private philanthropy, both in the US and Latin America, is more and more motivated to find ways of working together and pooling resources. Another emergent opportunity is around climate. Many of you will remember that in the 80s and 90s, many large foundations actually left Latin America to prioritize other regions. And it's been interesting to see some of those actors actually starting to return to active grant making in the region with an explicit focus on climate, because Latin America is not only a region that is seeing the effects of climate change, but is also a kind of key focus for strategies and solutions, many of which, the best ones, many of are, community territorially based. And so I would encourage organizations certainly that are working in the climate space to think about engaging with donors that are coming to the region for the first time, and supporting them to understand the giving landscape here. But also would emphasize that climate work goes beyond just sort of the typical topics that we might think of. It includes a number of intersectional issues like climate and education, or climate and health, or climate and forced migration. So I think there's a number of ways for organizations doing great work in the region to engage with the climate agenda and engage with climate philanthropy that is more and more visible in the region. And that, again, hopefully will continue to move in the direction towards supporting local actors and community solutions to climate challenges. Two more opportunities that I'll highlight. One is that 75% of you approximately already have some kind of engagement with U.S. donors, and I think one thing that is true of U.S. donors and hopefully donors in general is that we really do want to help organizations get stronger in a challenging moment, and we're often willing to be advocates with our peer funders. So I would really encourage the organizations that already have relationships, for example, with foundations in the United States or anywhere else, to be reaching out to ask for guidance and connections, introductions to new funders. I'll talk a little bit more about this moving forward, but as funders, we understand what a challenging moment this is, and it is in no way a deficiency or a point of vulnerability to be candid with your funding partners about how challenging the landscape is right now, and the specific needs that you might have. I would also note that I think a lot of the funders coming from the United States and giving in the region are really excited about the themes that are being explored in a space like this. So what more can be done to recognize and amplify and promote Latin American generosity, national philanthropy, individual giving in country? So one opportunity that you might consider if you have a relationship with an international donor is engaging them around support for your plans to broaden your national funding strategies, explore earned revenue or financial sustainability opportunities. I think it's fair to say that most international funders do not want to be the sole source of funding for organizations. We would really love to see organizations being able to survive and thrive with diverse revenue sources, including national sources. So that's one sort of option to explore in your strategic conversations with your donors. Are they willing to invest in your capacity to diversify your own revenue or funding? And finally, I'll just mention briefly, we've been really encouraged to see kind of emerging models of co-funding and investment in ecosystem strengthening. I think many other speakers at this conference will be speaking in much greater detail to this topic, but I think increasingly funders in the US who are giving in Latin America recognize that just providing individual institutional support to a few organizations is not sufficient, and that there's a lot to be gained from investing in the health of civil society ecosystems and in civil society resilience. And we see funders coming together to do that jointly. So one strong encouragement I would have is, most countries in the region have networks of civil society organizations. They have national actors that are focused on strengthening civil society capacity. If you're not already engaged in those networks, I would really recommend doing so, because I think that will be a point of investment over time from international donors. So before I hand it over to Doménica, I want to share kind of 3 final recommendations and then a poll that summarize what I've been hoping to communicate today. So the first recommendation is about realism. Being realistic about the potential for US and other international funding. The landscape has dramatically changed, and we don't see, with the disappearance of bilateral assistance, international cooperation, we don't see a commensurate increase in private philanthropy. That is not happening. And so therefore, we'd certainly encourage the organizations that are listening today to consider whether international funding options could be a part of your overall funding strategy. But for most organizations, it will not be the primary and certainly not, exclusive source of support for your organization. And Doménica will talk a little bit more about this, but part of being realistic is also making sure that you're approaching or pursuing opportunities that are actually a fit with the work that you do. In an environment of increasing competitiveness around open calls and so forth, really trying to focus on where you think you have a good fit with what a funder is interested in funding is the best path forward. Next, exploring intermediaries is a lower risk way to engage donors. So for most organizations, the vast majority of organizations, I would say, creating a US nonprofit, a 501c3, to be able to receive funds directly from the United States probably is not the most appropriate strategy for raising money internationally. We really encourage you to look to intermediaries, whether they're US based or based in the country that you work in, as a key partner to help access international funding. And many of these intermediaries also provide a range of other kinds of supports and institutional strengthening opportunities that your organization can benefit from. And finally, I just really encourage you to engage your current donors as advocates and thought partners. As I mentioned before, donors understand what a difficult moment this is, but they won't know specifically the challenges and opportunities you see unless you tell them. So now more than ever, I think is a time to share proactively what your concerns are, the opportunities that you see as well, and whether there are ways that donors can support you in your mission, whether that's investing in new areas of work, whether that's helping to make connections to other donors. It's really the time to open up the relationships, to have those conversations candidly. Because again, as donors, we can't help unless we know what the specific issues or challenges are that you're facing. And also if you have a relationship with a donor, maybe from a few years ago when the grant ended and you haven't been in touch since, pick up the phone. This is the time to reestablish those connections. Tell them what, how much the funding meant, how the work was successful, what you're doing next, and explore together whether they can be part of the next chapter of your organization's story. So we want to hear a little bit more from you about some of the challenges that you may have faced in engaging with international donors. So I'll ask our colleagues to launch poll number 2. And as you can see, this poll is translated into all 3 languages, so it'll take a little bit of time to answer. But what we're asking you to do is to pick the one response that represents your biggest challenge engaging international donors. So pick one response only, or pick other if we haven't anticipated your challenge with the options that are here. And then we'll look forward to seeing some of your responses. So we'll take a minute or 2 for that. Okay, Giving Tuesday team, are we getting some answers?
Yes, we are. We have almost 100 now.
Excellent. So while the remaining attendees answer the question, one thing I'll just mention is that we're now going to transition to Doménica's section of the presentation, which will be in Spanish. So if you do not understand Spanish, you'll want to adjust your interpretation settings for English interpretation. And if you're a Spanish speaker, you'll want to return to the main room because Doménica will be speaking to you in your language. And the Portuguese speakers, I think, can stay where they are, with apologies that that we haven't included your language in the same way today. Okay, should we take a look at the results? Okay, interesting. So it looks like, could you scroll down slightly? Or maybe I can scroll down. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So it looks like there's kind of two primary challenges and two secondary challenges. So the one major challenge is donor funding restrictions. And we have heard, and we will hear in other sessions about the, important work to motivate donors to give in more flexible ways, to provide multi-year support. Donor funding restrictions might also refer to donors that are focused on specific issue areas that might not be what your organization prioritizes based on the needs and opportunities that you see. And that's that second point. So lack of donors working in our areas of focus. That makes sense. And I think that is one thing that we have noted, that there are certain themes that are kind of more prominent among US-based donors and certain themes that are more prominent among Latin American-based philanthropies. One thing I will mention, and it gets to Mollie's point, or her story at the beginning of the session, is that sometimes maybe the biggest and most high priority organizations might not prioritize the work that you're funding, but smaller foundations, family foundations do. So Mollie, I know that's the case with disability related work, which is so important for you at the Tawingo Fund. So that is one thing that we're trying to do from the Latin America Funders Collective, is when we encounter donors who are open to giving in areas that are frankly underfunded from US donors, to really encourage them to connect with locally led organizations. And then more minor barriers are language and culture differences, and receiving and managing international funds. So it looks like many of you have been able to overcome, at least to some degree, some of the administrative challenges associated with receiving international funding, which is great. Okay, so we'll close that second poll. And Doménica, I will pass it on to you for your part of the presentation.
Thank you, Caroline. Gracias a todos. Vamos a dar un pequeño momento para que puedan ajustar la configuración desde el español al inglés y portugués para las personas que consideren necesario. Y bueno, vamos a seguir con la presentación. Como ya bien Mollie y Caroline mencionaban antes, hemos querido compartir con ustedes qué es lo que hacemos las tres organizaciones, y también un poco de lo que, de justamente las barreras que también nosotros como fundaciones encontramos tratando de poner a Latinoamérica en las agendas, en las mesas de diálogo, y todo lo que ya mencionaron anteriormente, ¿verdad? Es por eso que quisimos incorporar una última sección en esta presentación que nos parece un evento fenomenal realmente. Creo que no todas las veces tenemos la oportunidad de estar muchas personas juntas en diferentes niveles, trabajando en diferentes temas. Hemos entonces querido traer algunas herramientas que probablemente ya han escuchado en algunos otros espacios, pero que consideramos también estas herramientas van cambiando con el tiempo. Y ya sea organizaciones grandes cuando decimos en presupuesto, pero también puede ser en trayectoria, u organizaciones pequeñas que probablemente están iniciando una labor dentro del sector civil. Consideramos que es necesario estar actualizados, y porque como todo en la vida también va cambiando, esto es lo que hoy por hoy traemos como lo que nosotros hemos visto que es más actualizado para conectar o abordar a donantes en los Estados Unidos, en este caso. Siguiente, Caroline. Entonces vamos a hablar un poquito sobre qué es lo que los donantes están buscando en este momento, y también queremos hacer un énfasis en, no quisiéramos establecer una narrativa vertical sobre este tema, que queremos que esto sea una cuestión horizontal, en el sentido que tanto donantes como beneficiarios, organizaciones de la sociedad civil, puedan buscar una alineación que les beneficia a ambos, ¿verdad? También las organizaciones, y yo siempre lo digo a los socios de Focus, por ejemplo, están en toda la propiedad de decir no a un donante. Y en este caso, cuando se buscan donantes, también hay que buscarlo con una intencionalidad de si este donante se alinea también a la misión y a la finalidad que la organización o de la organización que yo represento. Entonces, algunas cuestiones que nosotros hemos realmente compilado y resumido porque hay varios aspectos, pero no los podemos mencionar todos por temas de tiempo. Entre algunos, bueno, sabemos que los donantes en este momento están buscando mucho la medición de impacto y transparencia, la flexibilidad y la confianza, la escalabilidad de innovación y la teoría de cambio que yo sé muy bien porque vi en el chat varias personas conocidas y sé que estamos ya trabajando con esto. Entonces, quiero detenerme un poco nada más en el punto de medición de impacto y transparencia porque usualmente cuando estamos hablando de este término, siempre lo asociamos a la parte técnica de lo que este proceso implica. Y desde nuestra experiencia queremos decir que tanto organizaciones grandes y organizaciones pequeñas han podido demostrar dentro de nuestro proceso de selección una evaluación de impacto. Y lo hemos podido observar, por ejemplo, a veces en organizaciones medianas o pequeñas, cuando han utilizado herramientas como Excel, herramientas muy básicas, fichas de control de una pre y post intervención de un proyecto. Entonces, queremos enfatizar que no necesariamente se requieren grandes cantidades de recursos financieros, por ejemplo, para denotar o demostrar una evaluación de impacto y que es posible hacerlo en el nivel en el que la organización está, siempre y cuando se pueda dar de una manera ordenada, ¿verdad? Y también se pueda planificar de esto de manera interna en la organización. Siguiente, por favor, Karen. También hemos podido ver en este evento, tuve la oportunidad de estar en la plenaria inicial y en una de las plenarias, la segunda plenaria. Sé que varios de nosotros estamos hablando sobre las tendencias filantrópicas este y el próximo año. Ya todos sabemos y las colegas también lo han compartido. Este año en particular ha sido un año muy difícil, ha sido un año complejo con el cierre de USAID, pero también muchos cambios que están pasando a nivel de cooperación internacional. Y bueno, buscando nuevas formas de cómo operamos en este sector. Nosotros hemos concluido estas 4 tendencias, pero por supuesto hay otras que en otras plenarias también se están hablando. Entre algunas de estas tenemos, por ejemplo, el crecimiento en el financiamiento temático. Ya Caroline lo mencionaba anteriormente. Eso se traduce, por ejemplo, para Latinoamérica en un financiamiento dirigido a todo lo que tiene que ver con el clima, a fondos dirigidos a proyectos innovadores vinculados a energía sostenible, por ejemplo, agricultura de resiliencia, entre otros. Otra tendencia que también podemos ver con más frecuencia es el auge de los fondos asesorados por donantes o lo que bien conocemos como DAF. Estos fondos básicamente permiten a los filántropos, corporaciones estadounidenses, donar de manera flexible y estratégica. Y un ejemplo puede ser un empresario, un individuo, una corporación en los Estados Unidos utiliza un DAF para distribuir recursos a distintas ONGs latinoamericanas sin involucrarse directamente en la gestión meramente operativa de estos fondos. Por otro lado, otra tendencia es la consolidación de la filantropía basada en la confianza. Quiero mencionar que desde Focus Centroamérica nosotros trabajamos con esta modalidad y creemos bastante que es una modalidad que coadyuva mucho, sobre todo a las organizaciones de base, a las organizaciones comunitarias y también a aquellas poblaciones que no siempre tienen la oportunidad de llegar a donde están las oportunidades. Por ejemplo, las poblaciones indígenas, población afrodescendiente, poblaciones rurales, entre otras. Otra de las tendencias es la consolidación de la filantropía basada en la confianza, creo que ya lo mencioné anteriormente. Una vez se ha establecido esta confianza, también estamos evitando un poco este tema de estar donando para proyectos de corto plazo. Y esto es bien conocido por todos nosotros que muchas veces las donaciones a corto plazo no solo limitan el impacto de las iniciativas, sino que coartan también lo que se puede hacer más allá de esta donación. Una tendencia que muy probablemente esté tal vez en menos recurrencia es el tema de las donaciones basadas en datos y tableros. Esta puede ser para organizaciones tal vez de mediana o grande escala. Y la modalidad es básicamente que tanto organizaciones como donantes puedan monitorear resultados en tiempo real, identificar qué funciona, qué no funciona, ajustar o hacer los ajustes necesarios que requiera un proyecto. Y esto también aumenta la rendición de cuentas. Es importante para nosotros y creo que para el sector adaptarse a estas tendencias, pero también quiero enfatizar que es importante saber en qué momento nos encontramos nosotros como organización para poder adentrarnos a una tendencia en particular. Siguiente, Caroline. También queremos mencionar que esta sección ha sido un poco un resumen de un documento que nosotros hemos elaborado desde la Fundación Focus Centroamérica. Ustedes lo van a poder encontrar en el apartado de los recursos de esta presentación, donde estamos extendiendo un poco más a detalle muchos de los temas, de los conceptos de los que ahorita estamos platicando. Y también vemos que así como nos ocupamos por parte de los donantes en poder posicionar a Latinoamérica, poder generar más alianzas, fortalecer las redes de contacto, también es importante estar preparados con toda la documentación y los conceptos, los procesos que, por ejemplo, una convocatoria de subvención requiere dentro de la filantropía. Y es así como hemos concluido algunos kits de preparación y documentos esenciales que consideramos y que también hemos podido observar con varios socios, perdón, que en este momento probablemente están aplicando a fondos, a convocatorias o están teniendo algún acercamiento con donantes, pero que en este proceso, ya sea de aplicación, de negociación de montos, de negociación de la subvención de proyectos, incluso de la redacción de estos mismos, muchas veces se encuentran un poco, se encuentran vacíos narrativos o de conceptos o de lenguaje que no se comprenden bien. Entonces, consideramos que algunos documentos o conceptos que pueden estar listos antes de abordar a un donante es, por supuesto, la documentación legal y financiera, los estados financieros, las declaraciones de impuesto, en el tema de marcos de impacto y gestión, lo que hemos venido hablando de la teoría de cambio, los planes de monitoreo y seguimiento, las políticas de salvaguardia. Hoy por hoy es muy necesario y se pide bastante, por ejemplo, si una organización está trabajando con niños, que se tenga una política interna de salvaguardia para este tema. Luego las políticas medioambientales va dependiendo de cada tema. Y luego, por supuesto, propuestas y presupuestos. Hay donantes, y esto también consideramos importante mencionarlo, hay donantes que van a requerir un presupuesto muy numérico, probablemente en un Excel, en una página, una o dos páginas. Hay otros donantes que van a requerir un presupuesto más narrativo de la iniciativa de la propuesta. Y aquí es importante que antes de aplicar a una convocatoria, se pueda estudiar un poco a cada donante, porque como bien sabemos también, cada donante tiene su propio proceso y sus propios mecanismos de selección. Entre otros documentos también están, por ejemplo, los materiales de comunicación, un one-pager. Nosotros utilizamos bastante esta modalidad porque tratamos de evitar un poco todo el tema de reportería, de estar escribiendo grandes propuestas que probablemente no van a conllevar a una respuesta positiva de un donante. Entonces, pienso yo que también en este momento de la filantropía es muy importante que pensemos en concretizar, en hacer muy conciso, muy práctico todo lo que nosotros requerimos a nivel organizacional y lo que también solicitamos a los donantes. Siguiente, Caroline. Como nosotros, muchos de nosotros acá también ya hemos tenido oportunidad de intercambiar o tener algún tipo de contacto con donantes, con actores internacionales, sabemos que el contexto actual nos conlleva a tener que diversificar los fondos. Y esto también no es un tema reciente, es algo que hemos venido platicando desde hace algunos años. Y nosotros hemos traído algunas modalidades de cómo algunos de nuestros socios están diversificando sus fuentes de financiación. Entonces, entre algunas están, por ejemplo, la expansión de las iniciativas de inversión por impacto, una mayor importancia del financiamiento flexible. Cada vez más organizaciones se están dando cuenta que hay una filantropía que es basada en la confianza y se están apropiando o acercando cada vez más a estos donantes. Por supuesto, los patrocinios fiscales para acceso a los Estados Unidos, generalmente con un 501c3, la diversificación hacia los ingresos propios. Para nosotros es muy importante este punto porque no solo la diversificación de los ingresos propios genera una estabilidad a largo plazo, sino que también impulsa a la organización a que pueda escalar a otros fondos. Un ejemplo es en el Triángulo Norte, nosotros tenemos algunos socios en Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, que desde ya están utilizando sus finalidades, sus objetivos de organización para generar o producir alimentos, por ejemplo. Y estos a la vez funcionan no solo para alimentar a la comunidad, sino que también para vender a otras empresas. Ahí ya se está generando un ingreso que sirve para sostener la organización y también para escalar esta iniciativa a largo plazo. También hay un creciente protagonismo en las alianzas público-privadas y filantropía. Muchas de las personas que estamos aquí somos parte de la red de WINGS y sabemos que este tema es uno de los que más apremian en este momento. Luego también están los fondos colaborativos con sociedad civil, la criptofilantropía. Quiero mencionar algunos ejemplos, por ejemplo, en México, Argentina, Chile, ya hemos podido observar y pueden ustedes consultar también algunas experiencias de iniciativas o proyectos que han sido financiados con criptofilantropía. Por otro lado, también está otra modalidad para diversificar las fuentes de financiación y estos son los modelos de donación recurrente. Yo considero que muchas veces, y porque he estado también desde el lado de la recaudación de fondos, muchas veces se desestima esa donación pequeña, pero muy significativa que llega mensualmente. Y en este ejemplo quisiera mencionar a Techo, por ejemplo. Techo tiene un sistema de donación individual mensual que funciona y que les da un gran valor a los ingresos que ellos tienen como organización. Siguiente lámina, Caroline. También hemos hablado sobre los estatus 501c3. Muchos de ustedes sabrán que a veces para adquirir o tener fondos de los Estados Unidos es muy necesario este estatus tan famoso. Pero también queremos traer a este espacio que no necesariamente es primordial tener un estatus 501c3. Nosotros queremos compartir algunas otras oportunidades o modalidades de cómo se pueden acceder a fondos sin tener este estatus. Y una de estas es, por supuesto, como muchos de ustedes ya trabajan a través de un patrocinador fiscal, una ONG con estatus 501c3, reciben la donación en nombre de una organización latinoamericana o del Caribe y luego transfiere los fondos otorgados, asegurando así la legalidad y también dando el beneficio fiscal a los donantes. Otra modalidad es la determinación de equivalencia de forma explicada. Por ejemplo, una fundación estadounidense contrata a un experto legal. Nosotros en las 3 fundaciones que representamos utilizamos bastante el servicio de NGO Source. Muchos de ustedes ya lo habrán escuchado, para verificar que una ONG extranjera cumple con los requisitos equivalentes de un 501(c)(3). Focus trabaja muchísimo con esta modalidad y hasta ahora ha sido muy funcional. Muchos de los socios entran a este proceso de revisión y para ello es necesario tener documentos, como ya antes mencionábamos, por ejemplo, los estados financieros, una estrategia a largo plazo, tener muy claro qué proyectos se tienen activos en este momento y dependiendo de qué tan rápido responda o sea necesario ajustar algunas cuestiones, una determinación de equivalencia se puede obtener entre 3 a 5 meses, más o menos o aproximadamente. Otra de las modalidades es el reporte de responsabilidad de gastos, es decir, un donante estadounidense asume la responsabilidad de monitorear y reportar para qué se utilizan estas donaciones, es decir, los fondos son otorgados, pero se exigen también reportes. Tal vez no son reportes como los que podría utilizar un cooperante o un actor de cooperación internacional, por ejemplo, pero sí que requiere cierto tiempo y orden dentro de la organización para poder detallar y explicar estos gastos. Otra de las modalidades actualmente son las alianzas con ONG en los Estados Unidos. Ya muchos de ustedes acá mencionaron que han tenido oportunidad o contacto con actores de Estados Unidos o fuera de los Estados Unidos. Y la última modalidad que podríamos mencionar es las plataformas de crowdfunding internacionales para donaciones deducibles de impuestos. Entonces, básicamente, cómo esto funciona es que en lugar de crear un 501(c)(3), las organizaciones latinoamericanas se asocian con una ONG registrada en los Estados Unidos. Y claro, tiene que haber una alineación, comparten ciertas misiones, objetivos, finalidad, y se obtienen los fondos y se obtienen también por parte del donante los beneficios fiscales. Algunos ejemplos de esos servicios son, por ejemplo, Global Giving, Network for Good y Miticos. Entonces, como pueden ver, sí hay oportunidades para acceder a fondos sin necesidad de un estatus 501(c)(3). Es siempre y cuando cada organización busque qué modalidad le conviene mejor y luego empezar a andar bajo esa modalidad, ¿verdad? Siguiente, Caroline, por favor. No me quiero detener mucho en esta lámina porque como ya les mencioné, hemos compartido como recurso para que puedan ustedes llevarse a casa y repasarlo con sus equipos, sobre todo con sus equipos operativos o con los equipos que están haciendo recaudación de fondos de manera constante. Hay varios conceptos que nosotros como desde el lado del donante hemos visto que hay un poco de desconocimiento cuando se está haciendo una aplicación o una selección de una organización. Y es muy importante para nosotros que también se pueda compartir este tipo de información, que muchas veces tal vez está aislada, ¿verdad? En este momento nosotros la hemos querido compilar y dejarla como recurso. Inicialmente se pensó como un recurso para organizaciones pequeñas y medianas de socias de Focus Centroamérica, pero hoy estamos abriéndolo aquí a todo el espacio porque también es un sentido de generosidad poder compartir todos estos recursos. Entonces, ahí van a encontrar de manera más detallada, por ejemplo, qué es un concepto de una carta de intención, qué es un formulario 990, qué es la teoría de cambio de una manera más técnica, cuál es la narrativa de un presupuesto, qué son los intereses, los costos, que hay muchos conceptos que se necesitan para a veces estar listos a un momento de negociación de un fondo. Y en este recurso Si quieres, puedes adelantar la siguiente, Caroline. En este recurso, solo para mostrarles, este es la parte visual del documento. Ustedes lo pueden encontrar en la parte de donde dice más, en la parte de recursos, y ahí van a encontrar el PDF. Nosotros le hemos denominado el proceso de Go No Go porque básicamente es para un poco encaminar a los socios a saber cuándo aplicar o no aplicar a una subvención internacional, no necesariamente de los Estados Unidos, pero en este caso hemos enfocado muchos de los términos utilizados por los donantes estadounidenses. Y quisimos hacer esto porque sabemos que, por ejemplo, hay muchas organizaciones que operan con equipos pequeños y que también están haciendo, en cuanto están haciendo recaudación de fondos, están haciendo actividades operativas, de pronto están haciendo networking y están haciendo diferentes actividades en muchos niveles. Este documento lo que procura es un poco facilitar de una manera práctica cuándo ir o no ir, cuándo aplicar o no aplicar y qué se necesita para entrar a una convocatoria. Finalizo con esto y quisiera regresar a la lámina anterior. Caroline, por favor. Vamos a hacer una última encuesta. Quiero decirles que hemos decidido integrar esos polls, estas encuestas, porque para nosotros también es importante conocer qué es lo que ustedes están percibiendo desde el lado del beneficiario, ¿verdad? Como nosotros también estamos tratando de abogar, de generar esta fortaleza en nuestras redes entre donantes, también es importante poder conocer qué es lo que ustedes están viendo desde el lado del beneficiario y de esta manera nosotros transmitir una información correcta para nosotros mismos y para los que estamos abogando. Entonces, ya está abierta la encuesta número 4, que básicamente dice si su organización ha conseguido involucrar a donantes internacionales, qué factores han contribuido a este éxito. Y ya podemos ver que muchos de ustedes están llenando esta encuesta. Si ustedes por casualidad no ven en esta encuesta algún factor que ustedes consideren que les haya funcionado, también lo pueden comentar en el chat y nosotros lo registramos. Perfecto. Por el momento hay una gran cantidad de personas que han dicho que su mejor o lo que más les ha funcionado, por ejemplo, es tener una conexión directa con junta directiva o con el personal de la organización o el actor filantrópico. Por otro lado, también hay una fuerte tendencia en la creación de alianzas con otras ONGs, lo que me parece genial, porque una de las cosas por las que yo personalmente pienso que deberíamos abogar cada vez más es la cooperación sur-sur, cómo nosotros nos presentamos y hacemos coaliciones y alianzas entre nosotros. En menor grado tenemos algunas modalidades que han funcionado, por ejemplo, personal o asesores de recaudación de fondos, la participación en espacios internacionales o viajes. Y bueno, también tenemos algunas respuestas sobre mi organización no colabora con donantes internacionales, lo cual nos deja también una data de la que tenemos que registrar de nuestra parte. Pienso yo que voy a terminar ahí la encuesta por temas de tiempo y antes de finalizar solo quiero de verdad de parte de Mollie, Caroline y mi persona dar las gracias enormes a todo el equipo de Giving Tuesday, a JP por realizar este evento. Para nosotros es muy importante poder compartir, ayudar, saber cómo podemos también colaborar con Latinoamérica. Está dentro de nuestro ADN y nada, sigamos festejando este evento que para mí es una fiesta latinoamericana. Así que gracias, JP, y cedo la palabra.
Gracias, Doménica, Caroline, Mollie, obrigado. Thank you. Gracias. Thank you. Gracias a todos que están acá por esta sesión. Vamos a tomar 10 minutitos más para un break, un bio break, porque tenemos la sesión final del día, del primer día, con Asha Curran y dos grandes amigos de América Latina, de la República Dominicana y Colombia. Fue muy interesante, fue muy rico, mucho muito obrigado, Doménica, Caroline e Mollie. Obrigado a todos, gracias a todos. Hasta pronto, hasta la próxima
Felicidades.
sesión.